I ask every guest who appears on this show, since it's called Jemele Hill is Unbothered. When did you become unbothered?
Unbothered. Explain what you mean by unbothered, because that
So,
almost seems like nothing, you
no,
know.
it doesn't mean you don't
Oh,
care,
okay.
right? All right. Unbothered is
Okay.
more where, you sort of reach a point where you're not consumed or concerned with what other people think about who you are, how you navigate the world. That to me is being unbothered.
Hmm. Okay. I wouldn't say I'm 100% there. It's an evolution for me, because obviously I'm bombarded with these inevitable comparisons to my parents, and I'm working through all of that process. But I would say I'm probably 85% there. What I can say is that the way that I'm wired, whatever it is I feel, and I feel deeply, um, if people don't understand, it will sometimes bother me that they don't understand, but I don't get stuck there. Let me just say it that way, because I'm very sensitive, even though I'm strong. I'm very sensitive, and I know we live in our world is not black and white. There's a lot of grays to me. There's some things that I obviously have matured to understand, and there's some things that all of us of conscience realize should be the case. But as you get older, you begin to um, grasp that life is very complicated, um, sometimes convoluted, and that there's certain realities that are going to be present in any generation of time. There's always going to be evil forces. So you can't have this superficial optimism, that we can get to this kind of utopia, but we can get to a place where we can create the kind of society and world where we can work through differences, conflicts, etc. Now, I am more cautiously optimistic that way, but I do realize, again, there's so many people in the world. Some people just they'll never get to a place where they are, quote unquote, fulfilled within themselves and not making hell for everybody else. There's just going to be some people like that, unfortunately.
Do
But I
you
can't let
do?
it alter me.
No, I heard that. But do you think we give? I often go back and forth with this. Like, do we give too much energy and oxygen to what is just a very loud minority? And
Yes,
okay,
yes, yes, yes. We don't give oxygen to the right things, the right voices. I mean, as soon as, some dissension, some divisiveness, some whatever comes up, that just tends to catch on, and it's like a wildfire. Um, and everything else is kind of, pushed to the side, a little muted, etc. I do believe that. I always said when President Trump was in office, it's one thing to reveal, what he was doing, how he was doing it. But we kept pounding, 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 giving him more air, giving him more oxygen, giving him more attention, giving him more of a platform. And that's why, honestly, there's so much that happens in the social media world. I can't get in a back and forth over and over with people who misappropriate my father's words and his work. There are some times that I have to address it, but I'm not going to address it and keep going back and forth, because guess what? That only gives that person a greater platform. You often look and say, how many followers do they have? You know what I'm saying? How many friends do they have? Do I want to increase that? So you have to think about that critically, because the more you do that, and you're not blowing up their platform. So it's a delicate balance to know when you have to, because you don't want to let it sit there. But if it's just a few people, few, retweets or whatever, it's like, let that die on the vine.
well, I'm sure you thought this, which is why you did it. But you know, his most recent birthday. I mean, you had to, or observance. I thought what you said to Senator Josh Hawley was entirely appropriate because he had put out a video that was completely misappropriating who your father was, what he stood for, what your family, I should say, stood for. And so for you to acknowledge and correct him on social media, because I think the gist of the video was that somehow Dr. King would have been against critical race theory. And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And it was entirely disingenuous. And I know that people do that a lot, but it has got to be even more damaging when you see people in that position and authority do that when it comes to your father's work.
Yeah, but being a Christian, people misappropriate the Bible. They've been doing it for centuries. And so I'm a minister of the gospel, so I've been trained in ministry. And because I have that early training and knowledge, my father's no greater than Jesus Christ, certainly God, no greater than God, or not even equal to them. And so if they did that to God, they do that to the Bible. That's why I said I have to balance it all, because even though people have done that with Jesus, God, etc., there's still Christianity is still a very humongous religion, and over time, I believe truth, as Daddy said, truth will rise again, and in the end, these are his words. He said, um, unarmed truth and unconditional love will win in the end. And so I have to stick with that. And the way I balance it is what you said. You kind of hit it and you don't dwell there. You do just enough. Because if you dwell there again, what happens is that person's platform just does this, 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 this. And it's at my, expense. And I'm not going to do that. So yes, it was appropriate to do it and say it, but not go, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in a lightning rod. And then all of a sudden he's got 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, 10 million followers. It's like, no, 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 no. Hit it
uh,
and then put the little fire out and keep moving and let the truth sit there. Because I tell people all the time, I said this to an audience, and it's probably hard to understand. And I don't even know how to break it all the way down. But I said, truth doesn't need help. All you need to do is put it out there. And when you put it out there, the more people that catch on and they put it out there, that's all you have to do. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, truth is just truth. Yeah, there'll be, other narratives or whatever. But I've seen, just living as long as I've lived, what Daddy said, the truth crushed the earth will rise again. I've seen, like, for instance, when we were in Vietnam, at the time, everybody, there's a battle in our country about, the war and us being in Vietnam. It was finally acknowledged, in the later 70s, that was a mistake. The truth of what my father was saying, was revealed. And so that's why, yes, you put the truth out there and you keep going. You don't have to banter with the person. Just keep speaking the truth. Because I think one of the things we do too often is we get stuck on the person. And that's why, in nonviolence, we teach people to stay focused on the issue. We're not trying to defeat the person. We're trying to establish the truth. Yeah, and that, or we're trying to, defeat the injustice, not the person, because people have to catch up. They got so much stuff in them that has to be purged. That has to be that, and sometimes people will never purge. There are things they have to be exposed to and learn. This again, it's not as cut and dry as we would like it to be. And so, and I've been in all kind of processes. I remember I used to consider myself so pro-Black that everything I looked at was through the lens of racism. Everything, literally. That's the way I process life. If anything happened, it was like, that's racism. But I don't do that anymore.
so how do you look through, what's your lens? What would you say? How would you describe it now?
Well, I mean, there are various ways. I mean, some of it is people are not exposed. They're ignorant. Um, you know, if you grow up insulated in a world and that's all you know, and suddenly you come into contact with somebody who sounds alike and say, hey, there's some truth over here, or there's some myth here that you don't quite understand and get, then they're going to remain like that. And it's going to be hard as people get older. That's why we have to do things starting at the youngest age. And that's why there's this whole attack now on the young age, because people know that if they get it at that age, this that we've been dealing with forever, we wouldn't be dealing with. And so I first approach people by saying, okay, that person is ignorant, or, they may be racist and they can't shake it. My attitude is whatever influence that I can have, whatever seed I can sow, that's what I'm going to do. Because I'm not responsible for somebody's change, but I am responsible for leaving them with what is true. But truth sometimes, this is so hard to explain. When my father developed his philosophy of nonviolence, he studied a man by the name of Hegel, and Hegel talked about the tension, the thesis and the antithesis, and the tension that exists between two thoughts. And what my father learned by this is that you have this thesis, you have this antithesis, and then you have the synthesis of all of that, which means that there are threads of truth in every position. My father was able to find threads of truth in things that he mostly disagreed with. And you get to this higher truth. And so the way I look at it is that my job is to elevate people to a place where I can hear what they're saying and try to find if there's any thread of truth to what they might be saying. And can I take that thread of truth and then match it with my thread of truth? Now, somebody may say my thread of truth, 70%, theirs is 5%. That doesn't matter. The point is, there's a higher truth that we have to get to. And so, again, I try to categorize things as ignorant. Some things as racist, depending on the context and the history of the person, because you do have to study that background to see, what this person's been exposed to, who they've been, what has been their platform, what has been their consistency. And that's the information gathering. I think if somebody says something, we immediately think racist, but it might not be racist.
Well, it's the process you're describing is finding common ground. And
Right.
I think it feels like that's harder to do these days
It
because
is.
it's very hard. Our politics are very extreme. There's a lot of outrage, a lot of anger, period. So as somebody who is in nonviolent work, who is also, a minister, how much more challenging is that for you in this time, considering the work that you do?
Actually, it's less challenging for me in this time than it was before, strangely enough. And some of
Now,
that is
I
because
did
of
not expect you to say that.
it is. It is. Because I'm a different person. I've moved, I shift, and I see the world differently. I see people, I see humankind differently. I know there's good in the worst of us and bad in the best of us. And so I have grown to a place, and I'm still growing. I'm not going to say I'm 100% there. I would say I'm probably 65 to 70% there. I've gotten to a place where I can shut down my opinion enough to listen. Because again, my goal is not to prove you wrong or to put you down or to shame you. My goal is to figure out, how do I elevate you? And so I have to listen long enough to see what this is, where this is coming from, because all of this stuff comes from somewhere, whether it's ignorance, upbringing, anger, et cetera. And what kind of revealed this even more to me, there was a protest during all of the situation after George Floyd. And there was an individual that was a part of one of the white supremacist groups. and they ended up in an area where there were, some of the people under the banner of Black Lives Matter. And that person said to that white supremacist person, "Why do you hate me?" And you know what the guy said? "I don't know." There is so much trauma in this nation all the way around. Some greater than other, but nonetheless it's trauma.
Mm,
And I learned by inviting some of the former Klans members, former neo Nazis, former skinheads, that some of the same reason they end up in those extreme places is the same reason our black kids end up in gangs. They're looking for a place to belong because they come from such brokenness. Um, and they end up in these worlds and they're just doing it out of their own hole and need and void. And then they become older people, adults, and they keep doing it. But they started as, 15-year-old, 14-year-old, whatever, 13. And it's like they don't even know they're just doing it. It's just now it's second nature. But they're doing it out of that pain in their own life, and they're causing much pain in other people's lives. And the problem is with all of this, that's one layer that we have to contend with. But the real layer are the people who are true, who are keeping the systems and structures in place that keep us, some of the whites that are in communities that have some of the same challenges that we have in terms of economics, keep us like this so that their system and structure that they have can stay in place and it can continue to undergird their own personal economy. So that's what the issue is that we have to begin to really look at. And sometimes we get caught on this low level fighting, with folks, these just they just straight up hurting. They're ignorant. Their stuff is so embedded in them, and they don't even know they're being used.
mm.
They don't.
Yeah,
And
I
guess
mean, it's
what? We're all being exploited.
yeah, I mean, your father obviously he did a lot of work around uniting people at a certain economic level with the Poor People's
Yeah.
Campaign Party, and because he understood that this is an issue of economics, because you have people they want the fight to take place at that level so that we will take, as they say, so you will not know who's minding the store, all right?
Exactly.
Because we're too busy fighting over the goods. You know, I think it was yesterday. Yesterday would have been your mother's 95th birthday.
Mhm.
So, how did you commemorate her birthday?
So we had a special beloved community talks um, yesterday evening with some incredible women, uh, two of whom knew my mother personally, Janetta Cole, Dr. Janetta Cole, a woman by the name of Doris Crenshaw, who was just 12 years old when the Montgomery movement started. And, they shared some very powerful stories, testimony, and gave some, some important insight. Um, and then I was with on my side of the panel because it was moderated by Monica Pearson, who for us growing up was Monica Kaufman here in Atlanta. It was me, uh, my sister Tamika Mallory, and Joteka Edie. And, we really had a conversation about how, my mother has influenced us, but also the work of just Black women in this society, the power of Black women and the things that, we can do, I think, in a way that no other group can do. And so that was one of the ways that I celebrated her yesterday is to really bring together women who knew and then women who've been inspired or influenced by her. And that was it. I actually went to the hair salon yesterday too.
Well, how often do you run into? I'm sure this has happened consistently through your life, but how often Are you in conversation with people who knew your mother, who tell you things about her that maybe you didn't know?
I've obviously heard different stories from people that I wouldn't know, but because um, I learned my mother's character and nature, it never surprises me. Like, whoa, it's never been any of that when they share the story. But if it's like, okay, well, I didn't know that. So that may happen periodically. I'm always collecting, stories about her. So yeah, I would just say it would be periodically, and I was trying to remember if there was anything specifically like that, and I can't recall it right now. But if it hits me at some point, I'll say it.
Well, it was a book. I read this book a few years ago about your mom.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and
Now that book, I helped to work with the writer
right, because the
because it
writer is
was
one
after
of her friends, I think.
Barbara Reynolds.
Writer remembers. Yep.
Right. And so my mother interviewed with Bob Reynolds. They were working on this book and things didn't work out at that time in like around 2000. So she had, numerous conversations with my mother. So I got an opportunity to help Barbara complete the book. And when we were going through it, now, there were a lot of stuff I did not know that Barbara had revealed from her conversations with my mother that were in the book, and that was like, wow, I didn't know that. I mean, that just totally shocked me. Now I'll tell you what I didn't know that I discovered after her death. My mother attended Antioch College, still around in Yellow Springs, Ohio, liberal arts college. I did not know that my mother did not graduate in the 4 year, 6 year cycle that people, when they go to college, they graduate in. Well, my mother talked about Antioch, in her lifetime, it just never came out that her matriculation was in that, successive time in getting her degree. I discovered after her death and when my sister passed, because my sister was over her estate, and then I was the person that took over her estate after my sister suddenly passed. I discovered in a box, her degree. And I looked at it and I said, I think it said 67, 1967. What? 1967? What is this story here? So I had to go on a search because I was puzzled and shocked. I thought my mother started school 44, 45, and she finished actually, I thought she finished 4 years later. I then also discovered it was 6 years that she matriculated there. And she just left and went to New England Conservatory of Music. My logic was she graduated from Antioch and immediately went to New England. No, she finished Antioch after 6 years, which I didn't know it was even six. And then I had to ask her sister, who was still living after she died, what was that about? And she didn't really want to talk in detail about it because there were some things that happened when my mother was in college where she had to stand up for herself. And I don't think the administrators appreciated it at the time, even though this was a liberal arts college, they're a little bit more open. My mother wanted to do her student teaching at the Yellow Springs, in the Yellow Springs school district, but it was still segregated. And she was upset about that. So she petitioned them. She then went to the president of the college, and the president of the college would not stand up for her. And she spoke out about it. And I think my aunt was feeling, even though she didn't tell me this is what I was sensing just by certain gestures and little bit that she was saying, that, they mistreated Coretta, or Corey, as she would call her. They mistreated her. Because it's like retaliatory. Well, I then discovered from a young lady who now works for us at the King Center as our Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer, who's done extensive research on my mother, that my mother didn't pass this specific test at Antioch. Now, the test probably was a more subjective grading because it was essay oriented. So you know how that goes.
Right.
And that may be what my aunt's saying, that, they just didn't want to pass her, even though she took it. But the test happened to be in the area. It wasn't directly these words, but this is what it was for that time, in the area of social change. So here you have this
Mm.
woman in the midst of this movement that is changing society, you know. And so I guess they said, well, we better give her her degree, because we're not going to look, this is going to come back to
This
haunt
is
us.
going to historically look terrible.
Exactly.
Yeah. You said something interesting during the interview that in many ways your your mother was ahead of your father. Um,
Mhm.
in what ways did you mean that?
You know, um, they both were strategists in different ways, but I think he was so into the movement as the leader, he didn't have enough time to really step back and understand what needed to happen to ensure future generations um, would benefit from what they were doing. And so she had this insight and foresight to see so far off. And it started early on, before the movement even got really going. She was already thinking something historical is happening and we need to capture this. So when he left to go make his speech with the Montgomery Improvement Association, he was preparing to make a speech as the president that night, because that's when the organization was started and he was nominated to be president. And this was after the full day of the first day of the boycott. She told someone, because she had just delivered my sister 2 weeks prior, yeah, and she told someone, birthed my sister. She told someone, take this tape recorder. The only reason we have that speech and those words today is because she insisted that that be recorded.
Mm.
So she was always like, we're in the midst of something. She knew it before him. That's what I'm saying. So in many ways, and then the Vietnam War, she was already a peace activist before they got married. And, was traveling. Once they got married, she went to international peace conferences, Switzerland and all over the place, and really encouraged him to lend his voice to their movement. She said, Martin, the peace movement needs your moral authority and your moral voice. And, I would hope you would, lend your voice. And, yes, there were other people talking to him about it, but I think because she was already there for years before they got married, and then by the time 67, 66, 67 got here, she was talking more about it. And she was the solid, single, steady voice and presence in that regard. That gave him the strength to stand, because he was critiqued from you talking about cancel culture? He was canceled by all his colleagues in the civil rights movement. And this was public. You know, the Johnson administration, started shifting newspapers. I mean, all of that. But my mother, again, is the one who was saying that. And then years later, she sees Henry Kissinger after that he's assassinated, and he pulls her to the side, because I think I forget what role he was in I don't know if he was Secretary of State then. He said, Mrs. King, you all were right about Vietnam.
Mm.
So she just, if you look at, if you read the book, I tell people that book is a manual of how to do a lot of stuff in leadership and strategy, etc. She was very strategic in how she got my father's reputation and work recognized in the world. That 54 years later, we're still contending with it, looking at it globally, not just in our society, not just in the Black community, but globally. When I went to the Nobel Museum for an exhibit that we worked on with a curator, about my father, which is the most comprehensive exhibit on his life and influence from before he was born to how, his work impacted movements today. They revealed to me that out of all of their Nobel laureates, whether you're talking about chemistry, medicine, literature, etc., Dr. King is the most researched. And so, not just the most researched, Peace Prize laureate, but all categories. They said over 50% of the people who come to our website on a daily basis are looking for something about Martin Luther King.
Well, the other interesting thing about it's a lot of interesting things, but one of the things that also struck out to me was um, in the book that is done about your mother is that it's a good blueprint, as you mentioned, about strategy, but is it also reminds you that even within movements, there's conflicts and tensions
Oh
and
yeah,
disagreements.
yeah.
And looking today at how the current movement has not only been shaped, obviously it has a lot to do with how your parents shaped the movement, but I look at how some of the conflict and tension is handled, and I think about her book often because I'm like, man, people don't know that this has always been the case within
It's
movements.
always.
So
Hmm.
you can't freak out when you see it, and it feels like today because of social media, because these tensions are given so much more amplification,
Patient, yeah.
yeah, that people think that that is a signal that things aren't working when I'm like, no, that this is generally how it's been. However, I did come across something interesting you said regarding today's movement. You said what you thought it lacked today was strategy. What did you mean by that?
Well, it seems to me that there's a lot of effort on um, bringing attention and awareness to what's happening, and not as much energy on what is the strategy to get to the end goal, or what even the end goal is. Because, a lot of people have different thoughts about, what we ought to be working towards, and the how, how should it look? Whether you're talking about dealing with the issue around reimagining policing, defund police. I mean, it's just all this conflict and tension around what is it going to ultimately be that we're trying to get to. And there has to be a critical mass of people who agree on that, because otherwise you work against yourself. And I think the beauty of what my father led, he was able to keep a critical mass of people together. Not that everybody was with him, we know that, but he had a critical mass of people who could agree on the ultimate goal and even the means to get there. The means meaning making sure that we keep our posture of nonviolence in place as we move toward it. Doesn't mean you're not going to have tension, you're not going to confront stuff, but it means you're going to practice, the principles and follow the steps of nonviolence, and that somebody is going to kind of, be the referee of that from Daddy and his camp's point of view, because even at that time, people didn't 100% ascribe to it at the level that my father did. He ascribed to it as a way of life. But, he knew how to work with people who saw it tactically, as a tactic to be utilized in this moment. They may have not had the whole piece. And so he worked with that, and he had people on his team who were able to manage all of that. So, I think coming together and deciding what is that ultimate thing and outcome we're trying to achieve, and putting together a step-by-step plan that has to be altered, tweaked, because you come against different resistances as you go along. I think that's what that hard work seems to me to be missing. Now there are pockets of people, who have entities and organizations like Color of Change, etc., that are doing some work like that. But what's happening is everybody's doing a lot of work, But what I don't see is the Nehemiah effect in the Bible, how Nehemiah was able to coordinate and connect the dots so that the energy of what they were doing to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, you know, was flowing together. So even sometimes I was reading something that Tamika was going to mention this morning, and I can't remember what it was. She was going to talk about Megan the Stallion, and I didn't read about it, so I didn't get all the details. But apparently, was she shot at or something? I can't.
She was shot in the foot
Yeah,
by yeah, she was shot in the foot by a
right.
man who, was allegedly, I think they were dating.
Yeah, that
And
was
he's
something, but it
also
was
a hip hop star.
yeah, that was something. But the other issue was about the young lady in Russia. And
Oh, Brittany
apparently
Griner.
there's some people
Yeah.
working behind the scenes with and Tamika was addressing that, and her point was, people understanding the importance of, the tension in the streets. And what I keep thinking about is, how do we connect the activists at heart with the more people who tend to work internally? Because they're all working, but they're not coordinated and connected. And I think that's why the rate and the level of change is not the level where it needs to be. And that was the thing. Daddy worked with Hosea the agitator. They it was part of the strategy. In fact, you know, I'm meeting with Johnson, as we saw in Selma, but I'm also going to be a part because Daddy could do kind of go in and out of all of that. Some people are straight activists and they can't do the negotiating, and they shouldn't because they don't have the temperament for it. And then there's some people who negotiate, they just don't have the strength of, of character or just the courage to be in the activist field. But all need to be talking to each other and coordinating the plan of action so that it complements each other. And I think that's what seems to be missing today. And I don't know how you connect it because it's in a world where everybody is important and got followers and audiences and all that. It's hard for us to, in the church world they call it submit to one another, but it's hard for us to coordinate and be humble enough to know where to yield in this area to somebody, and then they may yield to me in this area. It's just so difficult. And it's frustrating to me, I'm going to tell you, as one who is of it, but not in it that way. It's very frustrating because I believe that part of my calling is to help with that. And I haven't figured out how to do it yet.
So I think one of the reasons there is that fractured sense in the movement currently is that, obviously when it was your dad's time, that time, the movement started out of the Black church
Yeah.
for the most part. Today is not like that, that
Mm-hmm.
it's starting in other places. And if anything, it feels like the Black church part of it has been left behind. As a minister, who's in this work, how have you seen, uh, the Christian faith, Christian pastors, handle it or not handle being or feeling connected to the movement that's happening now? Because it definitely feels like, this is just my perception, it feels like there is a disconnect there.
So let's clarify one thing. There's the institutional Black church, and then there are Black pastors. And what I mean by that is there have been Black pastors a part of different, movements that have been happening across the country. We know it. They show up. They've been there on the front line. There was some there in Ferguson when we went down to Ferguson. Um, um, and so I wouldn't say that there's an absence. I think it's the fragmentation that we're experiencing. There has not been a collective force out of the Black church that has been tied and connected to what's happening. Now, there are some right now working together more, but it seems that there's still the disconnect you're talking about. It's like here in Atlanta, there's a group of strong faith leaders that's working around the voting issue. Just from my observation, I'm not sure how tied and connected it has been to some of that younger generation. But yet, what the efforts that everybody's doing is toward the same end, which is to make sure that people are registered to vote, to make sure that people understand the importance of voting, and then bringing attention to what's happening with the lack of the federal protections in place around voting and trying to put, continued pressure there. So that they are pastors and a collective working together. But again, I just have not seen, doesn't mean it's not happening. I just not have seen the connection. So how do we deal with the fragmentation is really the question. When so many historically, it's kind of like the story where when Jesus's parents went to I think it's like a census registration, and when they were leaving, they traveled a whole day's journey and didn't know they had left Jesus behind. And so they had to travel all the way back to go find him. That's when they found him in the temple. And he said, don't you know I should be about my father's business? That's something that needs to be unpacked, because that seems to be what has happened, is that the collective Black church, and the collective doesn't mean every single part, but a strong force of the Black church community kind of got into its own little world and became self-contained, in the religion of it all, and never kept connected with the culture. Now, it shouldn't follow the culture, but it got disconnected from the culture. I remember there was a rapper called, what was his name? L.A. Snow, here in Atlanta years ago. He came to visit me and a pastor that I was working with. I was assistant pastor. And he was just sharing with us, the church just does not welcome us. We wanted to, do this whole rapping thing. And so we went out and left, and so we didn't know how to embrace what was happening. And more importantly, how to embrace it in a way so that it maintained positivity as opposed to destructiveness. And so that's where this all started. The rift. This was right around the 90s. And so it's just, and that's why it's like, hey, nothing has progressed since then. We're sick and tired of this generation. And, we're just going to, we're going to do what we do because y'all clueless.
The legacy of your family is so enormous. Was it ever a struggle for you to embrace it? I mean, you're gonna be a king regardless. I mean, I get that.
Yeah, I'm gonna be one all the time.
All the
yeah,
time.
I mean, I
It doesn't
tried.
matter.
First of all, I ran from my ministry calling for eight years because of that. Because I was like, look, I want to be Bernice. I don't know what this means by me preaching, because I had to work all that out with being a woman and not seeing a lot of women, and certainly not somebody so young, preaching in our Baptist tradition. Although my grandfather was pretty progressive because he had one woman who was licensed to preach in the congregation. But it was like, I need my own identity. And then I didn't want to study, because I was called as I got a little bit older and understand, okay, I'm probably going to have to yield to this because it's not going away. I'm not going to even delve into my daddy. I'm not going to study. I'm not going to study. I'm not going to listen to him. Because I want to be me, Bernice. Whatever he did and how he did it, that's what he did. Let me find out what I want to do and how I want to do it on my own, track. So, it wasn't until I was in my 30s where, other than in theology school, I had to take one course about him. It wasn't really until when I was in my 30s that I started opening up to reading and listening. And the irony of it is, people will tell me you sound like your father. My mother even told me in my trial sermon when I was 25, she said, do you remember listening to him? I said, no. Do you remember watching him? I said, nope. She said, because you got gestures like him. I don't know. But, and then, to be honest, until my mother left this earth, I was hiding out. I would peek out. I do some things, like hide out. You got it. I show up when I need to, whatever. But once she left, I realized one, I had to grow up rapidly. Two, I had to step into the space to be a part of carrying this legacy forward. At that time, my sister was still around as one of the four. And I started taking it a little bit more seriously and embracing it. And then it still wasn't quite easy. It really wasn't until I got into the leadership at the King Center that I finally resigned into that role. And, I recognized that I finally settled in and said, you know what? That saying that your mother would repeat all the time, you don't have to be your daddy. You don't have to be me, but just be your best self. It now makes sense because you know what? I don't have to try to carve out this big, enormous legacy for Bernice because my parents did it. Because guess what, Bernice? They left a legacy. And somebody's got to carry it forward because otherwise it just dies on the vine. And you're it. So when people ask me now, what is your legacy? I tell them, look, I happen to be blessed with generations of social activists. I'm continuing in that tradition and in that vein because my great grandfather, my grandfather, my father, my mom, they were all social activists and humanitarians, human rights leaders. And I'm trying to make sure what my father in particular and my mother left behind is continued because they intended for it to get to a certain place. So I got to add my bit to this, and my responsibility is just to figure out what is my part in carrying this forward instead of trying to figure out, what's Bernice's legacy like separate and apart. It can't be. Like you said, I'm always gonna be their child, and this what they gave to this world is so important to this world, and it's a lot left to be desired related to it. So I'm honored to now be just a part of, advancing the legacy. I sign things now that says the dream lives, the legacy continues, because that's my responsibility to continue this legacy.
Well, I know I got to get you out of here in a couple minutes, but I'm going to end it with a game that I play with every guest on here. Now you get it easy.
Oh my God.
You get it easy because of time. You're only going to get one question. So it's a game that I play with all my guests called This or That. I give you two choices. You pick one. This
Oh
is
God.
always where the controversy happens. Okay. So we'll end it here. Here's the two choices. You got to pick one. Greens or mac and cheese?
Greens.
Now, see, you handled that like a pro. Now, don't let me find out you can make some mean greens. Can you make some
Now,
mean greens?
now, no, I can't. I know how to cook. I never had time to cook, but the only reason I chose it is because I have to manage the dairy intake. But trust me, if I didn't
Ah,
have to do
ah.
that, it would be hands down. Not, it has to be the right kind of macaroni and cheese. Everybody can't make macaroni and cheese. Ooh,
All right, but
I've had
if
in
not
my
for the dairy,
lifetime, I've had some bad macaroni and cheese.
and when it's bad, it is a disaster.
But can I tell you
Right?
something? The best
Mm.
macaroni and cheese that I ever had, a white woman from Memphis, Tennessee made it. And she was a member of Gilbert Patterson's church, Church of God in Christ.
Oh wow.
I was like, oh Lord, we're going to this lady's house. We're going to eat before we go. Because we don't, she offered to cook and everything. We were scared. Got there, she laid us out on this picnic table. Girl, everything she cooked. I kid you not. It was so good. It was the first time I ever had fried green tomatoes.
Wow, I love fried greens and tomatoes. Those are so good. Well,
you would have thought it was your grandmama from what's the name of that area in Mississippi? Is it
oh,
Natatoshis or something?
oh
Mississippi,
yeah, no,
down in
yeah,
Mississippi. You would
yeah,
have
down in the
thought
desert.
because she put her foot in those that food, the greens, the macaroni and cheese. What else? I mean the yams. Oh my God, that's the best macaroni and cheese I ever had.
Well, you know what? I consider that to be racial progress. That's how you. That's the common ground. That's the thread that we can all jump in. If we have good mac and
Yes.
cheese, a lot of the world's problems will be solved immediately, or greens in your case. Well, Dr. Bernice King, thank you so much for joining me and spending your time with me. And so many people appreciate not just the work of your parents and your family, but of you specifically. So thank you for being a
Thank
voice
you.
and for your continued commitment to nonviolence, which is really quite extraordinary. Look, God, some days I have to just say, God knows my heart, and just leave it at that.
But you know, I
Because
would love you to go through our online Nonviolence 365 online experience. I really would. So I'm inviting you to do that. And
invitation accepted.
inviting your listeners, it'll revolutionize your heart and your life. And, you know, at the end of the day, violence will never solve a thing. It feels good because I've been to that place at the end. It's like, yes, that energy, that adrenaline gets to, rushing through you. But it's like, what did I just accomplish? What, you know,
I don't need the violence part of it because I don't want to get sued. But some
but
days it
even
just feels.
verbally, but
I was
even
like, I
verbally,
was
it
like,
feels good.
I just got to stop cussing people out. That's all. Like,
Yeah. That's what I'm
yeah,
saying. If you
yeah.
go through this, it'll revolutionize you internally.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean you'll perfect it, but you'll have something to check you in a way that's never checked you before.
All right. That's a word. I will accept that invitation, and I'll let you know when I go through it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you so
Appreciate you.
much.